The air inside the stadium had grown thin, a suffocating heaviness that sat in the lungs of 80,000 people who had spent the last 4 hours screaming. It wasn't the exhaustion of a long night. It was the distinct, prickly unease that comes when a massive crowd senses a shift in the barometer, a drop in pressure that precedes a tornado. The main event had ended in a controversial draw, a finish that left the audience in Philadelphia restless, their energy vibrating between disappointment and aggression. Trash littered the ringside area. The commentary team sat in hushed tones, recap monitors flickering, trying to fill the dead air, while the production crew scrambled to figure out why the copyright graphic hadn't flashed on the screen yet. The show was supposed to be over. The lights were supposed to come up. But they didn't. Instead, the arena plunged into a darkness so total it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. It wasn't a lighting cue. It felt like a power failure. The emergency exit signs cast long, eerie red shadows across the confused faces in the front row. There was no pyrotechnics, no countdown, no familiar static of a Titantron glitch, just a void. Michael Cole's headset feed bled into the broadcast, a hot mic catching a frantic, unscripted whisper to the production truck asking if they were still live. The confusion was palpable, rippling from the ringside barricade up to the nosebleeds. People stopped checking their phones. The low murmur of the crowd died down, not out of respect, but out of a primal instinct that told them to be quiet. For a full 60 seconds, nothing happened. The darkness held the arena hostage. Then, a sound began, not music, but a low-frequency hum that rattled the chest cavities of everyone in the building. It sounded like the groaning of metal under immense pressure, a ship hull about to breach. The hum grew louder, more dissonant, scratching against the ears until it became almost unbearable. Commentary stopped trying to explain it. Corey Graves, usually quick with a witty remark to save a botched segment, remained dead silent. The camera operators, unsure where to point, focused on the empty ramp, the lens hunting for focus in the gloom. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to genuine anxiety. This didn't feel like a wrestling show anymore. It felt like an intrusion. A single spotlight snapped on, hitting the center of the stage with the violence of a gunshot. It revealed nothing but the bare metal grating. No smoke, no lasers. Just the harsh white light illuminating the empty space where a superstar should be. The crowd hesitated, waiting for the cue to cheer, but none came. The hum cut out abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The uneasiness in the building was now a physical weight. Security guards at ringside turned their backs to the ring, eyes scanning the crowd, looking nervous. Then the sound of footsteps echoed over the PA systems. Low, deliberate, amplified footsteps of boots on metal. Clank. Clank. Each step was spaced out, methodical, lacking any urgency or showmanship. It was the cadence of an executioner walking the final mile. She stepped into the light, and the reaction was not a pop. It was a gasp, a sharp, collective intake of breath from thousands of people simultaneously realizing they were looking at a ghost. Jade Cargill stood at the top of the ramp. But she was unrecognizable from the polished, statuesque superstar who had vanished from the public eye 2 years prior. Gone was the platinum hair, the glittering gear, the perfectly curated aura of a goddess. Her hair was cropped short, dark, and natural. She wore no sequins, no branding, just simple, functional black combat gear that looked worn, almost tactical. Her arms were at her sides, hands loosely balled into fists, her posture lacking the theatrical flexing of the past. She looked leaner, harder, stripped of the veneer of sports entertainment. The crowd didn't know what to do. A few pockets of fans started to chant, but it died in their throats, strangled by the oppressive atmosphere radiating from the stage. She didn't pose. She didn't acknowledge the camera. She didn't look at the fans. Her eyes were fixed on the ring with a predatory, hollow intensity that unsettled anyone watching on the screens at home. It was the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier returning from a war that nobody knew was being fought. Michael Cole finally broke the silence, his voice devoid of his usual broadcaster hype, sounding genuinely shaken. He simply said her name, not as an announcement, but as a question, as if he needed to verify what his eyes were seeing. Jade began to walk down the ramp. There was no music. The only soundtrack was the murmuring of the crowd, a sound that resembled the buzzing of a disturbed hive. As she passed the fans along the barricade, they didn't reach out for high fives. They pulled back. The energy she projected was not inviting. It was volatile. She moved with a frightening economy of motion, ignoring the sign-waving children and the screaming superfans. This wasn't a return. It was an invasion. The camera caught the face of a security guard as she passed. He looked terrified, stepping aside as if a wild animal were loose. She reached the steel steps and paused. For the first time, she looked up, scanning the arena. The hard camera zoomed in on her face. There was no joy there. No, I'm back smirk. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, dark circles prominent under the arena lights, conveying a story of suffering that no promo could articulate. She slowly wiped her feet on the apron, a gesture usually reserved for respect, but here, it felt like she was wiping away the dirt of the outside world before entering a combat zone. She pulled herself up the ropes, not vaulting over them with her usual athleticism, but stepping through them methodically. She walked to the center of the ring and stood perfectly still. The silence returned, heavier than before. The world was waiting for her to speak, to explain, to do something that fit the script. Instead, she just stood there, breathing, a statue of raw nerve and unresolved trauma. The interruption came from the unexpected arrival of the reigning champion, who stormed down the ramp with a microphone, desperate to reclaim the spotlight that had been so thoroughly stolen by silence. The champion, a loud and brash figure who had carried the company during Jade's absence, slid into the ring, shouting insults, trying to force the segment back into the realm of standard wrestling theatrics. She got in Jade's face, screaming about disrespect, about the timeline, about how the business had moved on. The champion poked Jade in the chest a sharp, provoking jab. The crowd flinched. Jade didn't blink. She didn't recoil. She slowly tilted her head, looking at the champion not as a rival, but as a minor inconvenience, a fly buzzing around a lion. When the champion raised her hand to strike, Jade moved. It wasn't a wrestling move. It wasn't a grapple or a suplex. It was a blur of violence. Jade caught the champion's wrist, twisted it with a sickening torque that dropped the woman to her knees, and delivered a single, stiff strike to the jaw. The sound of the impact flesh on bone echoed through the microphones. It was too loud. It was too real. Champion collapsed, eyes rolling back, completely limp. The referee, who had been hovering in the corner, rushed in, waving his arms, signaling for the bell that never rang. He reached for Jade, trying to back her off. Jade turned her head slowly to look at him, and the official froze, hands trembling in the air. He saw something in her eyes that told him to stop. She looked back down at the unconscious champion. There was no pinfall attempt, no taunting. Jade simply grabbed the championship belt that had fallen on the canvas. She looked at the gold plating, the glitter, the symbol of everything she used to chase. The crowd watched, paralyzed, expecting her to raise it high. Instead, she let it drop. It clattered onto the mat next to the fallen body, treated with the indifference of trash. Jade turned and exited the ring the same way she entered, silent, methodical, terrifying. She didn't look back at the carnage. Medical staff rushed past her on the ramp, sliding into the ring with panic in their movements, calling for neck braces and stretchers. The commentary team had stopped speaking entirely. The feed cut to a wide shot of the arena, showing thousands of people standing with their hands on their heads, witnessing a level of aggression that shattered the suspension of disbelief. This wasn't a heel turn. This was a statement that the game had changed, and the rules of engagement no longer applied. Backstage, the atmosphere was chaotic. The camera, usually steady and cinematic, shook as the operator jogged to keep up with Jade's retreating figure. Wrestlers and road agents lined the hallway, pressing their backs against the concrete walls to give her a wide berth. There were no scripted confrontations, no interviewers jumping in for a scoop. The fear in the eyes of the roster was genuine. They weren't acting. They were reacting to a colleague who had returned as a stranger. Triple H stood near the gorilla position, his head set around his neck, watching her approach. He didn't look angry. He looked concerned, a deep furrow in his brow, his hands on his hips in a posture of helpless observation. He made no move to stop her. Jade walked past the production crates, past the catering area where staff had stopped eating to stare, and headed straight for the exit door. The sounds of the arena, the confusion, the delayed booing. The frantic medical calls faded as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, muting the world she had just broken. The camera lingered on the closed door for a long, uncomfortable moment before cutting away. Social media began to melt down instantly. The timeline wasn't flooded with Jade's back-hype graphics. It was filled with shaky fan footage of the medical team attending to the champion. The blurred lines between script and reality caused a frenzy. "Is this a work?" trended alongside "She actually hurt her." The dirt sheets were silent, having received no leaks, no rumors, no context. The lack of information turned the return into a global news event. Locker room sources were reportedly texting journalists that the mood backstage was funeral-like. The broadcast ended not with a recap package, but with a somber shot of the empty ring, the championship belt still lying on the canvas where Jade had discarded it. The silence of the commentary team spoke volumes. They signed off without their usual catchphrases, offering only a subdued goodnight that felt more like a question than a farewell. The copyright logo finally appeared, but the screen stayed black for 10 seconds too long, leaving viewers staring at their own reflections in dark screens, unsettled and hungry for answers that weren't coming. In the days that followed, the company did not release a statement. There was no press release, no YouTube exclusive, no suspension notice. The silence was the loudest marketing campaign in history. When Jade finally appeared on screen again, it wasn't in a wrestling ring. It was a pre-taped vignette, filmed in black and white, sitting in a dimly lit room that looked like a basement or a bunker. She wore plain clothes, her face devoid of makeup, the raw exhaustion still present. She spoke softly, her voice raspy, a stark contrast to the shouting promos of the industry. "You want the storm?" she whispered, looking slightly away from the lens. "You want the lightning. You want the show." She paused, her eyes finally locking onto the viewer, piercing through the screen. But storms run out of rain. Lightning strikes the ground and vanishes. I am not a storm anymore. I am the drought. I am the thing that comes after the disaster, when the rebuilding feels impossible. She leaned forward, the shadows deepening the hollows of her cheeks. I didn't come back to save this place. I didn't come back to rule it. I came back to show you how fragile your heroes really are. She stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, a harsh, lonely sound. The woman who left wanted your applause. The woman who returned only wants your silence. The screen cut to black. There was no logo, no match announcement, no date. Just the lingering feeling of dread. The audience was left with a chilling realization. This wasn't a redemption arc. It wasn't a quest for gold. Jade Cargill had returned as the personification of consequences, a mirror held up to the industry's excess and vanity. She was the entropy in the system, the inevitable decay of the superstar era. The viewer didn't click away to the next video. He sat there, staring at the black screen, haunted by the idea that the entertainment was over and something far more real and far more dangerous had just begun. The question wasn't who would beat her. The question was, what would be left of the company when she was finished?